The deep space exploration ship U.S. Revenant glided through the darkness of space, its hull nearly invisible against the backdrop of the stars. The ship's advanced cloaking system kept it hidden, a necessary precaution in the dangerous outer rim of the galaxy. Captain Elias sat in the command chair, eyes fixed on the holographic display in front of him. The distress signal had been looping for the past hour, a faint, eerie transmission coming from a planet officially marked as dead in the galactic records. "Are we sure about this?" Lieutenant Carter asked, his fingers hovering over the control panel. This world was wiped out 200 years ago. No life signs, no survivors, just ruins. "Then who's sending the signal?" Elias muttered, his gaze narrowing. The transmission played again, distorted by time and radiation interference. A voice, hollow and strained, whispered through the ship's speakers. "They are gone. We thought we were the predators, but something worse hunted us. Run, before they find you too." Silence filled the bridge. The crew exchanged uneasy glances. The Zithar had once been the most feared species in the galaxy, an apex predator race that hunted for sport, enslaved entire civilizations, and left only ashes in their wake. And yet, they were gone. Not conquered, not scattered. Completely wiped out. Elias took a deep breath. "Bring us in closer. I want a full scan of the surface." The ship descended toward the planet's orbit, passing over massive craters and shattered cities. The ruins of Star war machines lay scattered like broken bones, their once mighty battle stations reduced to husks of metal. The devastation was beyond anything the crew had seen before. It wasn't just destruction, it was annihilation. "Captain," Carter said, his voice tense, "I'm picking up something. Not life signs exactly, but movement. Deep in the ruins." Elias frowned. What kind of movement? Unclear, but it's artificial. Could be automated defenses, or something else. A flicker of unease ran through the crew. The idea that anything could still be active on a world where an entire species had been erased was unsettling. "Prepare a landing team," Elias ordered. "We're going down." The Revenant's dropship cut through the thick, dusty atmosphere, landing in the middle of what had once been the Zithar capital. Massive structures loomed overhead, their jagged remains casting long shadows under the planet's pale sun. The air was heavy with the scent of burned metal and decay. Elias and his team stepped out cautiously, their weapons at the ready. The silence was overwhelming, as if the entire world was holding its breath. "Keep your comms open," Elias said. "If anything moves, I want to know about it." They moved through the ruins, past shattered towers and streets littered with the skeletal remains of Star warriors. Their weapons were still clutched in their bony hands, their armor burned and melted as if they had been caught in a firestorm. "This wasn't just a war," Carter murmured. "This was extermination." They reached the source of the distress signal, a crumbling communications tower, its beacon still flashing weakly. Elias stepped forward, activating the terminal. The ancient system groaned to life, displaying fragmented records. He scanned through them, his expression growing darker with each entry. There were no enemy battle reports, no signs of a conventional war. The record simply stopped, like a story cut off mid-sentence. One moment, the Zithar were at the height of their power. The next, they were gone. And then something else appeared on the screen. A final entry, a last desperate message from his Star commander. "If anyone finds this, know that we were not the strongest. We were not the hunters. Something else came for us. Something we could not fight. They did not conquer. They did not bargain. They simply erased us. And now, they are still here." A sharp noise echoed through the ruins. Elias spun around, weapon raised. The rest of the team followed, scanning the dark alleyways between the ruined buildings. "Did anyone hear that?" Carter whispered. Another noise, closer this time. A scraping sound, like metal against stone. "Movement, 30 meters ahead," one of the soldiers reported. Elias motioned for silence, stepping forward cautiously. His visor's night vision flickered to life, revealing something in the shadows, something moving. A silhouette, humanoid but wrong. Its body shifted unnaturally, its limbs too long, its movements too smooth. The figure stepped into the dim light, and the team froze. It wasn't a Zithar. It wasn't human. It was something else. And then it spoke. "You should not have come here." The transmission cut out. The Revenant's systems flickered. And deep beneath the ruins, something woke up. The Zithar had ruled the stars for centuries, their names spoken in hushed whispers across countless civilizations. They were the galaxy's apex predators, a race designed for war, for the hunt, for domination. Their bodies were built for killing. Tall, armored scales running down their backs, razor-sharp claws that could cut through steel, and eyes that could see in total darkness. Their strength was legendary, their speed unmatched. But it wasn't just their physical abilities that made them feared, it was their minds. The Zithar were not mindless beasts. They were intelligent, calculating, and ruthless. They took pleasure in the hunt, in watching their prey squirm, in seeing the last flicker of hope die in their victims' eyes. To them, war was not about conquest. It was about proving their supremacy. Entire planets were turned into hunting grounds, their populations scattered and terrified, waiting for the inevitable slaughter. The Zithar didn't just kill, they played with their food. Across the galaxy, they became legends. When a Zithar war fleet appeared in orbit, there was no negotiation, no surrender. There was only the hunt. They had no interest in diplomacy, no need for allies. They saw other species as weak, pathetic creatures that existed only to serve as prey. They did not conquer planets to rule them. They burned them, stripped them of life, and moved on. One of their favorite rituals was the blood hunt. When a new species was discovered, the Zithar would not attack immediately. Instead, they would send scouts to observe, to study, to understand the weaknesses of their new prey. And when the time was right, the blood hunt would begin. Thousands of Zithar warriors would descend upon the planet, giving the inhabitants a single rule: survive. No armies, no resistance, just a desperate game of hide and seek, where the only outcome was death. The blood hunts were a test, a way for the Zithar to prove their dominance. If a species failed to impress, they were wiped out. If they fought back, they were exterminated. If they ran, they were hunted for sport. The Zithar had purged hundreds of worlds this way, leaving nothing behind but ash and the echoes of their victims' screams. They thrived on fear, and yet, for all their power, the Zithar had one unshakable belief: they were untouchable. They had never known defeat. No species had ever stood against them and survived. They believed themselves to be the absolute pinnacle of evolution, the undisputed rulers of the cosmos. Their arrogance was unmatched, and it was that arrogance that led to their downfall. The first time the Zithar encountered humans, they treated them no differently than any other species. They watched, they observed, and they prepared for the blood hunt. Humanity seemed unimpressive, small, fragile creatures that lacked natural weapons, without claws or fangs, without the thick hides or natural armor that many other species possessed. Physically, humans were weak. Their homeworld, Earth, was resource-rich but strategically insignificant. The Zithar expected them to fall quickly, to panic, to break under pressure like all the others before them. The first human colony to face the Zithar was Epsilon Prime, a newly established outpost with minimal defenses. The Zithar descended upon it, expecting a slaughter. What they found instead was something they had never encountered before: resistance. The humans fought. They did not run. They did not beg. They fought with everything they had, and more importantly, they adapted. The Zithar had expected a hunt, but what they got was a war. Their first wave of warriors was met with carefully coordinated ambushes, traps, and explosives. The humans used the terrain to their advantage, striking from the shadows, disappearing before the Zethar could retaliate. The creatures that had always been the hunters suddenly found themselves hunted. The Zethar were forced to retreat from Epsilon Prime, leaving behind the bodies of their fallen, something they had never done before. They called it a fluke, an anomaly. They told themselves that humans were simply lucky, that their tactics were cowardly, unworthy of true warriors. They regrouped, prepared a larger force, and attacked again. This time, they would crush humanity completely. But the humans had already learned. With every battle, they became stronger. They studied the Zethar, just as the Zethar had studied them. They found weaknesses in the Zethar's armor, exploited their overconfidence, and turned their own tactics against them. The Zethar relied on brute strength, on intimidation, on breaking the will of their prey. But the humans did not break. They adapted. They evolved. What started as a simple hunt turned into a full-scale war. The Zethar began to lose battles, then entire planets. Their fleets, once considered unstoppable, were torn apart by human warships using AI-driven strategies they had never encountered before. Their warriors, once unmatched in combat, found themselves facing cybernetically enhanced human soldiers who were faster, stronger, and more resilient than any natural-born fighter. The Zethar's greatest strength had always been their belief that they were invincible. But now, for the first time, they felt something they had never known before. Fear. It was slow at first, a whisper among the warriors, a doubt in the minds of their leaders. But as more and more of their worlds fell, that fear grew. The Zethar had never considered the possibility of extinction. They had always been the ones wiping out other species. The idea that they could be the ones facing annihilation was unthinkable. And yet it was happening. The final turning point came when the Zethar homeworld itself was threatened. Their warlords gathered in desperation, trying to understand how a species they had dismissed as weak had become their greatest enemy. They searched for answers, but by then it was too late. Humanity had already decided their fate. The last message sent from the Zethar War Council was intercepted by human forces. It was a single sentence, a chilling realization from the species that had once ruled the galaxy. We were the apex predators, but we were never alone at the top. The hunt was over, and the hunters had become the hunted. The Zethar had never seen humans before. To them, it was just another routine hunt, another species to dominate, another world to burn. Their warships arrived at the edge of human space, like a shadow creeping over a battlefield. Silent, cold, inevitable. The first target was Epsilon Prime, a colony barely a decade old. It was not a military outpost, not a fortress, just a small settlement with farmers, scientists, and engineers. It had no planetary defenses, no warships in orbit, just a few outdated patrol ships and ground security forces meant to handle small pirate raids. The Zethar saw it as easy prey. Their ships descended without warning. The colony's communications were jammed, their orbital satellites disabled in an instant. From the sky, fire rained down, blinding beams of plasma scorching the earth, reducing buildings to molten slag. The Zethar warlords watched from above, waiting for the inevitable response. Fear, surrender, desperation. Instead, they saw something different. The humans did not run. The colony's security forces took up arms. Farmers and engineers grabbed whatever weapons they could find. The people of Epsilon Prime did not beg or panic. They fought. The first Zethar landing forces were met with resistance. Human snipers hidden in the hills picked them off as they stepped off their dropships. Explosions ripped through the streets, makeshift bombs placed in alleyways and under bridges. The humans did not stand in open battle. They struck from the shadows, hit fast, and disappeared before the Zethar could retaliate. The warlords watching from orbit were confused. This was not how prey behaved. The Zethar sent more warriors, expecting to crush the resistance. But the humans had already adapted. They used their terrain, turning the ruined buildings into traps. They studied the Zethar's armor, learning where to aim. A single well-placed shot to the throat could bring one down. A plasma grenade, thrown at just the right angle, could crack their exoskeletons. Hours turned into days. Days turned into weeks. The Zethar had planned to conquer Epsilon Prime in less than a day. Instead, they found themselves locked in a brutal urban war, fighting an enemy that refused to surrender. And then came the moment that changed everything. The humans activated an emergency distress beacon, a last-ditch effort to call for help. They knew no warships were nearby. They knew no reinforcements were coming, but they sent the signal anyway. Not because they expected to be saved, but because they wanted the rest of humanity to know. We are fighting. We are still here. What the Zethar didn't expect was that someone was listening. The distress call reached the nearest human fleet, a small battle group led by the warship Valkyrie. Captain Adrian Knox listened to the desperate voices of Epsilon Prime, the sound of gunfire in the background, the screams of the wounded. He knew they would never hold out much longer. Knox made a decision that changed history. He ordered his fleet to jump to Epsilon Prime. He had no idea what they would find. He didn't know if they could win, but he knew one thing. Humanity did not abandon its own. When the Valkyrie and its escort ships arrived in orbit, they saw the devastation below. Cities burning. The Zethar warships circling like vultures. The colony on the brink of total annihilation. And then, humanity struck back. Knox gave the order. The Valkyrie's railguns roared to life, unleashing hypersonic projectiles that tore through Zethar hulls like paper. Missile barrages streaked through space, finding their marks, turning enemy ships into fireballs. Human fighters weaved through the chaos, striking fast, evading counterattacks with impossible precision. The Zethar warlords were caught off guard. Never before had they faced an enemy that fought like this, an enemy that adapted, that struck with ruthless efficiency. Human pilots didn't just fight with skill. They fought with desperation, with fury, with the unyielding drive of a species that refused to be broken. The Zethar forces on the ground suddenly found themselves trapped. The human fleet began dropping reinforcements, armored soldiers, enhanced with cybernetic implants, their weapons designed specifically to counter Zethar physiology. For the first time in their history, the Zethar were being pushed back. The fighting was brutal. The streets of Epsilon Prime ran red with blood, Zethar and human alike. The warlords watching from orbit couldn't believe what they were seeing. The humans weren't just surviving, they were winning. And then came the final blow. The Valkyrie targeted the Zethar command ship, a massive war cruiser that had orchestrated the invasion. Knox didn't give them a chance to retreat. He ordered a full barrage, every railgun, every missile, every energy weapon the fleet had. The Zethar warlords watched in horror as their command ship cracked apart, its burning remains falling toward the planet below. Without leadership, the remaining Zethar forces panicked. Some tried to fight. Others tried to flee. It didn't matter. The humans hunted them down, one by one. And just like that, the impossible had happened. The Zethar had lost. The survivors retreated into deep space, their minds struggling to comprehend what had just occurred. This was not how the hunt was supposed to go. The prey was not supposed to fight back. The prey was not supposed to win. The Zethar had always believed they were the ultimate predators, that they were untouchable. But as they fled into the darkness, one thought haunted them. For the first time in their history, they were afraid. The war should have ended after Epsilon Prime. The Zethar should have learned their lesson, should have left humanity alone. But they didn't. Their pride wouldn't let them. The defeat at Epsilon Prime was an insult they could not tolerate. For the first time in their history, they had been forced to retreat, and the shame of it burned in their hearts. The Zethar warlords declared vengeance. Humanity was not just prey anymore. They were an infestation that needed to be wiped out. So they came back, with a fleet 10 times larger, with warriors bred for slaughter, with firepower strong enough to burn a dozen worlds. They did not come to hunt this time. They came to exterminate. The first human colonies fell in days. Planets that had once thrived were reduced to nothing but scorched wastelands. Millions died. And for a moment, it seemed like the war would end before it truly began. But humanity did what it always did. It adapted. What started as a desperate defense turned into something else, something darker. The humans studied the Zethar, learned their weaknesses, and struck back with a kind of fury that shocked even their own leaders. They stopped fighting for survival. They started fighting for revenge. Human scientists worked day and night to develop weapons specifically designed to kill Zethar. They engineered viruses that could eat through their armor, biological agents that could turn their own bodies against them. They built war machines that could tear through entire armies. And they unleashed it all. At first, the war was fought in space, with fleets clashing in the void, human warships striking with terrifying precision. Then it moved to the ground, city after city, world after world, turning into killing fields. Humanity didn't just fight, it hunted. Entire Zethar battalions were wiped out in the night by unseen attackers. Human soldiers with cloaking technology would sneak into their bases, slaughter them in their sleep, and leave their corpses as a warning. They became the very thing the Zethar had once been. The creatures lurking in the dark, the monsters that made the enemy afraid to close their eyes. The Zethar had always believed they were the apex predators. Now, they saw what true predators looked like. The turning point came when humanity pushed into Zethar-controlled space. It was no longer about defense. The humans wanted more. They wanted to erase the Zethar from existence. The war that had started as a battle for survival had transformed into something worse, an extinction event. And humanity didn't care. There was no mercy, no negotiations. Every Zethar planet they found was burned, its population slaughtered. Human warships bombarded entire worlds until nothing remained but ash. They didn't stop at the soldiers. They went after their civilians, their young, their elders. They didn't just kill Zethar, they erased them. The Zethar had never known fear before. Now, it consumed them. They tried to surrender. They sent desperate messages, pleading for mercy. But humanity had none left to give. The horrors of Epsilon Prime, the billions lost in the early days of the war, it had hardened them, twisted them into something unrecognizable. They were no longer fighting for survival. They were hunting for vengeance. The final battle took place on the Zethar homeworld, a planet that had never known war, a place the Zethar had always believed was untouchable. When the human fleet arrived, there was no great speech, no offer of surrender, just silence. And then the skies burned. The bombardment lasted for days. Cities were reduced to rubble. Oceans boiled. The Zethar fought with everything they had, but it wasn't enough. Humanity had become too powerful, too relentless. The warlords who had once commanded entire armadas were slaughtered in the streets by human soldiers who showed no fear, no hesitation. And then it was over. The Zethar were gone, not defeated, not broken, erased. And for the first time, humanity looked at what it had done. They had won. They had survived. But at what cost? The Zethar had once been the galaxy's greatest hunters, a species that had ruled through fear and strength. But in their destruction, humanity had become something far worse. They had become the monsters. The end had come. The Zethar, once the dominant predators of the galaxy, were reduced to a single stronghold. Their homeworld, Drakthun, the cradle of their civilization, was all that remained. Every other colony, every outpost, every fleet had been annihilated by the relentless march of humanity's war machine. They had tried to run. They had tried to hide. But there was nowhere left. Now, as the last of their kind stood on the scorched ground of their dying world, they looked up at the sky, watching as the darkness was torn apart by the arrival of the human fleet. The stars disappeared behind an armada of warships, their hulls blackened from battle, their weapons glowing with the fury of 1,000 conquered worlds. The final assault had begun. But the Zethar would not die on their knees. They had once been the apex predators, the masters of the hunt. If this was to be their end, they would make it a death worthy of their legacy. The warlord Zervek, the last high commander of the Zethar, stood atop the ancient citadel, his crimson armor cracked, his once proud warriors reduced to a fraction of their former glory. He gazed upon the ruins of his world, his clawed hands gripping the hilt of his warblade. Behind him, the last remnants of his species, soldiers, civilians, even the young, stood in silence, awaiting the inevitable. They had no illusions of victory. There would be no retreat, no salvation. But if the humans wanted to erase them, they would have to fight for every last breath. The first wave came like a storm. Drop pods slammed into the ground, unleashing human shock troopers clad in exosuits, their weapons designed specifically to pierce Zethar armor. They moved with ruthless efficiency, cutting down anything that stood in their path. The Zethar fought with everything they had. Their warriors charged into the fray, wielding plasma lances and kinetic blades, their primal roars echoing through the burning ruins. The battle turned into chaos. Hand-to-hand combat in the streets, explosions tearing apart the last remaining strongholds, the sky filled with streaks of fire as human warships rained destruction from above. Zervek led the charge himself, his warblade slicing through the armored figures of the human invaders. He moved like a force of nature, faster and stronger than any of his kind had ever been. But for every soldier he cut down, 3 more took their place. The Zethar's greatest strength had always been their ferocity, their ability to dominate lesser species through sheer force and terror. But humanity had long since stopped being afraid. They did not hesitate. They did not falter. They fought like beings who had already won. Zervek watched as his warriors fell, one by one. He saw his people dragged from their shelters, executed in the streets. He saw the great spires of his ancestors crumble under the relentless bombardment. And then he saw something worse. The human flagship descended through the smoke-filled sky, its massive hull casting a shadow over the battlefield. From its landing bay emerged the one who had led this war to its final stage, Admiral Adrian Knox, the architect of the Zethar's extinction. Knox walked through the carnage with the cold precision of a man who had done this 100 times before. His armor was scared, his face hardened by years of war. He stopped a few meters away from Zervek, his rifle hanging at his side, his expression unreadable. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Zervek did something no Zethar had ever done before. He dropped his warblade. The sound of the metal hitting the ground was drowned out by the fires raging around them. But Knox heard it. He saw the look in the warlord's eyes. Not fear, not submission, but something far worse. Defeat. This is not how it was meant to be, Zervek said, his voice quiet, almost lost beneath the distant echoes of battle. You were supposed to be prey. Knox didn't answer. You could have stopped, Zervek continued. You could have let us flee, let us fade into the void. But you didn't. His mandibles twitched, a bitter laugh escaping him. Now I see. We were never the hunters. We were just waiting for something worse. Knox raised his weapon. This ends now. Zervek took a slow breath, closing his eyes for just a moment. Then he opened them, and with one final roar, he lunged. A single gunshot echoed through the ruined city. Zervek fell to his knees, a burning hole in his chest. His breath came in short gasps, his strength fading. He looked up at Knox one last time. What will you do now, Predator? Knox didn't answer. He didn't need to. The last warlord of the Zethar collapsed, his body still, his kind forever silenced. And with that, it was over. The last of the Zethar had taken their final breath. Their legacy, their history, their entire existence, wiped from the galaxy. As Knox looked over the ruins of their world, he felt no triumph, no satisfaction, only silence. Humanity had won. But as the fires burned around him, as the last remnants of an entire species were reduced to ash, One thought lingered in his mind. What had they become? The war was over. The Zithar were gone. Not just defeated, not just broken, gone. Their cities were nothing but crumbling ruins, their once mighty fleets reduced to drifting wreckage. Their hunting grounds, the worlds they had once ruled without fear, were silent now. Humanity had done what no other species had ever managed. They had wiped out an entire race, and now there was nothing left to fight. Admiral Adrian Knox stood on the bridge of the U.S. Revenant, looking down at the charred remains of Drakthun, the Zithar homeworld. Fire still raged across its surface, the last embers of a species that had ruled unchecked for centuries. The war had changed everything. Once, humanity had feared the dark, feared the unknown terrors lurking in the vastness of space. Now, they were the terror. The galaxy had watched as humanity transformed from desperate survivors to unstoppable conquerors. The broadcasted images of burning Zthar worlds, of human soldiers executing their enemies without hesitation, had spread across the stars. And the message was clear. Humanity was no longer prey. A silence had fallen across the galactic community. The other species, those who had once dismissed humans as weak, as primitive, were now afraid. They had seen what happened to those who crossed them. They had seen what humanity became. Reports came in from the outer systems. Border patrols of alien empires withdrawing from human space. Treaties being rewritten. The once great warlords of other species suddenly offering peace, trade, anything to keep from drawing humanity's wrath. They called it the Silent Year. No wars, no invasions, no challenges. Because no one dared. Knox turned away from the viewport, his thoughts heavy. He had led humanity through its darkest hour, had watched billions die, had given the orders that turned entire planets into graveyards. They had won. But at what cost? He walked through the corridors of his ship, past soldiers who no longer celebrated victory, only waited for the next battle. Past officers who had once fought for survival, and now fought because they knew nothing else. This war had forged them into something new, something unstoppable, and something terrifying. Deep in the heart of human space on Earth, the United Terran Council gathered in secret meetings. They spoke not of rebuilding, not of peace, but of the future. If humanity could do this to the Zithar, what else were they capable of? What happened when they ran out of enemies? Rumors spread through the ranks of the military, new weapons being developed, new strategies, entire fleets being constructed, not for defense, but for expansion. The galaxy had left humanity alone, but humanity was no longer content with being left alone. They were hungry. Knox had once believed that this war had been necessary, that they had been fighting to survive. But now, as he stood on the bridge of the most powerful fleet the galaxy had ever seen, he wasn't sure anymore. They had become something worse than the Zithar. They had become the monsters in the dark. And the galaxy would never be the same again.